I think that we are entering an electricity first paradigm. I think that AI is really only the start of this. It's being complemented by the electrification of transport and heating, as well as increased automation and robotics. So, in my opinion, the future is not going to necessarily belong to countries that have the largest fossil fuel reserves, but rather the countries that have the cleanest, most reliable electricity generation, transmission, and distribution networks.
Welcome to Sustainability Leaders. I'm Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO. On this show, we will talk with leading sustainability practitioners from the corporate, investor, academic, and NGO communities to explore how this rapidly evolving field of sustainability is impacting global investment, business practices, and our world.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Bank of Montreal, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
Welcome back to another episode. I'm Alma Corteselva, Senior Advisor at the BMO Climate Institute. Today, we're exploring one of the most important topics in sustainability and technology, the growing energy needs of data centers and what that means for communities and the transition to clean energy. Joining me today is Doug Morrow, Director ESG Research at BMO Capital Markets. Welcome, Doug, and thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with one of the most important questions. Data center growth has accelerated significantly during the recent years. What is driving the demand for data centers?
I think data centers are growing really because of the enormous infrastructure requirements of AI, as well as machine learning and cloud computing. So let me give you some numbers. So in the mid 2010s, there were about 3,000 data centers or so in the US. So that's the data center capital of the world. Today in the US, there are over 5,000, and another 1,000 or so data centers are under construction or being planned. It's not just the number of data centers either, it's also the size. So today, we're seeing some data center campuses exceed 1 million square feet with over 1 gigawatt power capacity. These would support the AI workloads of the hyperscalers such as Google, Meta, Microsoft, and Amazon. In the 2010s, a 30 megawatt data center was considered large. That's about 3% of what's considered large today. I think another important thing to flag for your listeners, the amount of CapEx that's driving this data center build out is historically unprecedented. The hyperscalers invested about 300 billion or so in CapEx in 2025. It's close to 700 billion this year. It's not exclusively for data centers. That also includes chips and power, et cetera. But those numbers just give a sense of the enormous scale of what's happening. And to your point, this investment is having a lot of knock-on effects. It's pushing up electricity demand, it's contributing to higher power prices, and in some cases, it's causing strain with local communities, which we'll probably get into. But just to close out here, I think what this has really done, though, in summary, it's really put electricity back on the map. It's really easy for us to forget that electricity demand in Canada and the US was basically flat for 20 years, going back to 2000 to the early 2020s, even though the GDP of countries like Canada and the US more than doubled during that time. I believe that we are entering a whole new paradigm of electricity consumption due to this data center build out, the advancements in AI, as well as the electrification of transport and heating and automation and robotics.
What is making data centers more visible to the public? And then what developments in energy technology or community planning are making it more visible?
Yeah, so I think it's important to put this in perspective. Data centers have been, part of the urban fabric of many cities for quite some time. If we think about New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and others. And I think generally the early data centers did not really attract much scrutiny from the public because they were relatively limited in size. All of this started to change in approximately 2023, 2024, due to the AI boom, the huge proliferation in the number of data center projects, and an increase in their size and resource requirements. So we've seen community pushback against data center developments in places like Tucson, Franklin Township, and Michigan, as well as countries like Ireland, the UK, and the Netherlands. Something else I want to keep in mind is that data centers have traditionally been located close to cities and population centers because this reduces latency and it lets them take advantage of really dense interconnection networks. But what's interesting now is we're also seeing data centers pop up in more far-flung locations that have abundant space, less congestion, etc. So, for example, Montana or rural Georgia, or here in Canada, there's talk about data centers in northern Alberta. So, this location decision really depends on a host of factors, including things like subsidies, how attractive the host communities are, and the data center's technical specifications. But just if I can go back to your question then for a sec, I'm not sure there's been any one technology that has made data center operations more visible. I would say in general, data centers are becoming more transparent, but there's still a long way to go, in my opinion. So, for example, the hyperscalers, who we mentioned already, and the major co-location companies like Equinix and Digital Realty, they don't always publish their data centers' power usage effectiveness, so that's PUE, or water usage effectiveness, so that's WUE. And as a result, in some cases, local communities do not know how much energy and water the data centers in their district or neighborhood are consuming. Now, among big tech, we would probably say Google has gone the furthest with this type of reporting, but I still think there's a big opportunity for the industry as a whole to improve the transparency of those data centers. I think investors have played a key role here in helping to move the needle by filing shareholder proposals and pushing for PUE and WUE reporting. And I would also flag the work of civil society groups like Data Center Watch. They've done a really good job highlighting some of these impacts that data centers are having.
Another factor that I believe it's sometimes making it visible to communities and like people in general is that they're normally associated with a rise in electricity cost or higher electricity bill. How accurate is that? And then are there other factors that are making the electricity bills higher for people?
Yeah, so that's kind of the big question, and it's become a political question. So I don't think there's any doubt that data centers are pushing up electricity bills, but it's not the only factor. So I think that's really the key point to internalize. Data centers are part of the issue, but they're not exclusively driving the issue. So it's really a confluence of a lot of different things going on. We know that utilities are committing to build new power generation assets for data centers. But utilities are also facing a significant number of challenges in terms of replacing aging infrastructure that's independent of the AI boom and the data center boom. They're also adding redundancy, and climate change is also a major factor because they have to improve their resilience to erratic weather and wildfires. One number for your listeners, over 70% of the US grid infrastructure is more than 25 years old. And here in Canada, much of the Canadian grid is approaching the end of its designed lifespan. So the facts are that in the US, electricity prices in US cities are up by an average of 41% since the start of the pandemic. And like I said, it really has become lumped into the broader affordability debate that's taking place right now through the so-called Ratepayer Protection Pledge. So this was convened a little while ago with all the major tech companies, so Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Oracle, XAI, and OpenAI. And what it is, it's a voluntary, non-binding pledge that these companies will basically fund their own power infrastructure, for example, with their, behind the meter projects or special types of contracts that are carved out from front of the meter generation.
Related to that, Microsoft, one of the big ones, just introduced a community first approach to data center development. Can you describe in more detail the program for the audience? How is it related with what you were saying previously that they are moving to funding and then making sure that they're doing improvements? And then in your view, what kind of practices genuinely build trust in host communities? Is what Microsoft doing really changing the way that it would be perceived by communities in a more positive way?
So your reference to Microsoft. So this actually came out before the Ratepayer Protection Pledge, and I believe was influenced by what Microsoft had done. So what Microsoft did, this was published back in January 13th, and it's basically a 5-point plan that the company published to address this exact issue. So community concerns around data center construction. So really, it's a commitment to pay their own way with electricity, to minimize data center water use, to invest in partnerships to train local workers, increase the community tax base, and invest in AI training programs. So, we kind of read this as a well-intentioned statement, but one that is really short on specifics. So it's not clear, for example, if that applies to new builds, to all of Microsoft data centers, how it would actually be executed, we just don't know. But I think the fact that this statement was published and attracted such buzz in the media, it really underscores that opposition to data centers has become, yeah, like I said, a bona fide business issue for tech companies. I think to answer the second part of your question, I think more generally, what's interesting to me is that management teams are recognizing that some of the core pillars of sustainable investing, such as engaging stakeholders, addressing community concerns and project development, and really, amping up on transparency, these practices are highly applicable to data centers and digital infrastructure plans. Let me give you a quick story. So I was listening last week to one of my favorite podcasts. I've been listening to this podcast for years. It's just great. They've got, really, really good business insights. But to be totally honest with you, they don't think much about ESG or sustainable investing. Well, I could hardly believe my ears. Last week, they started talking about how quote unquote community trust and building social license is a key factor in the US winning the AI race. And it was a real aha moment for me because it really showed that a lot of these underlying principles that those of us in the sustainable investing world have been talking about for over 20 years, it really shows how these principles are more relevant than ever, even though, sustainable investing as a whole has, quite rightly, in my opinion, attracted a fair bit of criticism over the last couple of years.
If you were advising a company building a new data center, what community practices would you recommend they give priority from day one?
That's a good question. I would say we'd have to go back to basics and look first at the nature of the pushback. So the nature of the pushback is being driven by three factors, I would say. So one is perceived increases in local electricity prices. Two is potential reductions in local water supply due to the cooling requirements of data centers. And the third is I would kind of group it as a catch-all, basically perceived insufficient economic benefits relative to the hassle of having a large data center being built in the local community. So I suppose if I were in an advisory seat, I would say mechanisms that insulate local ratepayers from power price increases would be important. So obviously this is already being talked about, as we mentioned, with the Microsoft pledge, as well as the pledge that was convened by the White House. So let's see how that plays out over time. I would also encourage companies to consider beyond compliance investments in water management and efficiency. So I believe that the water issue is probably the one that is most easily solvable. Even comparatively simple fixes, such as installing closed loop air cooling systems instead of more traditional evaporative methods, can significantly reduce the water requirements of data centers. Yes, they're more complex and cost more, but in my view, they're really prudent investments, especially in water scarce regions such as the Western US and the Colorado River Basin. They might hit margins, but given the resistance to data centers and the fact that it's hardening, I really think that this is something worth considering. I think that there's limited scope for addressing the third point of criticism, which is that data centers don't always boost local economic growth. It's true that data centers require a lot of temporary construction jobs, but once they're up and running, in my opinion, they're not really seen as long-term job creators. Finally, kind of enveloping all those points, I really come back to transparency. So as the saying goes, sunshine is the best disinfectant. So this means practices like tracking PUE and WUE, setting efficiency targets and reporting on progress, and being upfront with local communities about mistakes and lessons learned. So I think that those are some of the practices I would flag.
I just have a follow-up question. What's the nexus between water and data centers? And then how is water used by data centers?
Well, water is used for cooling. So that's the main application for water in a data center context. There's many different types of water options available for cooling. There's traditional air conditioning, there's evaporative cooling, which tend to be really, really water intensive unless you employ the closed loop, systems that we talk about. We're also seeing advancements in alternative water cooling because what's happening is a lot of these new chips from NVIDIA and others are just so incredibly powerful that you can no longer rely on traditional cooling methods to dissipate the heat. So that's why we're seeing more investor conversations around alternative cooling, such as direct to chip cooling, two-stage immersion cooling, and things like that. So especially in the case of two-stage immersion cooling, that's very much like a leading edge technology that's, I would say, in the process of being kind of commercialized and rolled out, but we don't see a lot of it yet. But yes, the main application or use of water is for cooling because it's really critical for data centers to dissipate the heat that is created from these high energy workloads.
No wonder you mentioned making that one of the priorities. Also, at some point of our conversation, mentioned climate change. We have higher global temperatures, and then the growth of AI and digital infrastructure. How do you see them intersecting broader climate and clean energy goals and then higher rising temperatures?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways to look at it. So we do know that the AI and data center boom is going to make it harder for big tech to reach their climate goals. I think that's pretty clear. I think management, many of the companies, has been pretty open about this. We expect to see some companies' climate goals and carbon reduction goals get restated as a result. So among the big four of Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and Alphabet, we haven't seen any dramatic changes yet, but it would not surprise me if we saw some softening around these targets, especially as we get closer to 2030. On the other hand, I think that the hyperscalers have really been instrumental in growing the clean energy economy. So again, the big four of Amazon, Meta, Google, and Microsoft are consistently the largest corporate buyers of renewable energy in the world through PPAs and RECs and other market instruments. And they're also increasingly building out their own behind the meter renewable generation, which is really, really interesting. Something I would flag for your listeners, though, changes are coming to Scope 2 reporting under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it could make it more difficult for big tech and other companies to use some of these instruments to report their Scope 2 emissions using the market-based method, especially unbundled RECs. I think it's possible that hyperscalers could increasingly be challenged to make the claim that their data centers are green if these changes are implemented. So it's something that we're closely following in the market.
Following up, would these changes that you were mentioned on Scope 2 emissions affect Canadian, US, both markets?
Yes, they're being considered and implemented through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This year is pretty much a year of consultation, and the final changes will be published in Q1 of 2027. So we have at BMO published on this issue. We're keeping on top of it. I find that a lot of investors, not all, let's put it this way, not all investors are aware that these changes are taking place, and they could have pretty profound implications in terms of how data centers or how the big hyperscalers market their data centers in terms of being green, because you frequently read that, data centers are 100% powered by renewable energy. Well, that claim hinges upon the market-based method of Scope 2 calculation in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And the more that that's tightened up, for example, some of the changes that are being require grid and hourly time matching. I believe it could make it more challenging for a lot of these data centers to make that claim.
We're going to have you in another episode to explain and then develop more on that topic. More to come. And my final question for this episode, as demand for digital infrastructure continues to grow, what might the next 5 years look like for energy planning and coordination between communities and industry?
Yeah, so I believe that one thing that has to change is permitting reform. I think there's opportunity here to streamline permitting while ensuring that the social and environmental impacts of data center projects, as well, frankly, as other large infrastructure projects, are addressed. Bringing more electricity onto the grid is the rate limiting step of AI advancement right now in the United States. So in 2024, just to put some numbers on this, the last full year that we have data for, the US added about 89 gigawatts of power capacity to its grid. That brought total capacity of the US electricity system to about 1,300 gigawatts. As one point of comparison, last year China added 543 gigawatts, so about 6x that of the US, and it brought the total capacity of the Chinese power system to 3,900 gigawatts, or about 3x that of the US. So I really think over the next 5 years, we need to find a sweet spot where sustainability impacts on local communities are sufficiently mitigated, but project timelines are shortened. Second, I think the data center boom and the strain it's putting on the grid has really put us on the cusp of a breakout for battery energy storage systems. We all know solar and wind are the quickest and cheapest ways to generate electrons, but they will always suffer from intermittency. This means that they do not match the load profile of a data center because it requires 24/7 constant power. But what's happening is large batteries can help solve this limitation, and their economics are becoming more and more attractive as battery prices drop. So the average pack price for stationary lithium-ion batteries is now around the $70 per kilowatt level, and that seemed completely unthinkable only 2 years ago. So I definitely think that's something to watch over the next 5 years. And then last thought, I think that we are entering, as I said before, an electricity first paradigm. I think that AI is really only the start of this. It's being complemented by the electrification of transport and heating, as well as increased automation and robotics. So in my opinion, the future is not going to belong necessarily to countries that have the largest fossil fuel reserves, but rather the countries that have the cleanest, most reliable electricity generation and transmission and distribution networks.
Thank you, Doug, for sharing your insights and helping us understand how data centers, energy systems, and community priorities intersect. It's definitely a complex topic, but conversations like this help explain what responsible growth can look like in the years ahead. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Sustainability Leaders. This podcast is presented by BMO. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. Press the follow button if you want to get notified when new episodes are published. We value your input, so please leave a rating, review, and any feedback that you might have, or visit us at bmo.com/sustainability leaders. Our show and resources are produced with support from BMO's marketing team and Puddle Creative. Until next time, thanks for listening and have a great week.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.